Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. Especially if you've an appetite for narrative puzzles, since I received a review key for the latest addition to Kaigan Games Simulacra series, Simulacra 3. I know it's a very creative naming scheme. Specifically, join me as I share my experiences with this investigative horror to see if the sequel simply parroted its predecessors or if this trilogy ended on a triumphant note. I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. Welcome to Stone Creek, a picturesque little town off the coast, the perfect spot to visit, if their council is to be believed. And yet beneath the quaint veneer of community lurks a lie, a disturbing set of disappearances which goes unchecked, or would were it not for the fact that you've been dragged into the thick of things. A solitary cell phone delivered to your door by a journalist hungry for a story, and the chance to find out what happened to her friend. Premise-wise, it's similar enough to how the other Simulacra games go, what with you finding yourself tasked with sifting through a cell, searching for signs of what happened to the prior owner, as well as any hints to the overarching situation. That, and slowly being introduced to increasingly unnatural phenomena. And like its predecessors, you progress forward through the narrative through a combination of dialogue choices, interspersed with segments of digging up clues and solving puzzles. That said, there's a rather distinct difference introduced to this entry in the series, one that'll be almost immediately noticeable to veterans, and it's a matter of tone. Simply put, while earlier games in this series had a certain penchant for bleak humor while still occasionally finding the time to lean into the overly silly, this one strives to take itself a lot more seriously. That's not to say you won't find some bits of dry wit to latch onto and a bit of character quirkiness besides. I'm looking at you, Persephone. But as a whole, the entire experience feels a lot more grounded. Unfortunately, that isn't the extent of the changes, as whilst it's managed to cultivate a more consistent tone for this entry, it finds itself lacking in a different department. Simply put, Simulacra 3 feels a lot more like a narratively streamlined experience, lacking the nuance and complexity that made the second game so compelling, at least insofar as a mystery. That's not to say it doesn't pose interesting questions to the player or provide new wrinkles to the overarching lore of the series as a whole. That said, unlike my time in Simulacra 2, I've never found myself seriously racking my brains over the motivations and sincerity of the characters I encountered, or hard-pressed and digging up dirt in order to piece together the larger picture. To the point that it almost feels linear, because whilst there are some small decisions you can make along the way, there really isn't a great deal of content for you to discover or play around with off the beaten trail, at least insofar as affecting the story. There's bits of lore to absorb, yes, but most things that would majorly change the outcome of the story boil down to the very end of the game and play out almost independently of your actions until that point. And frankly, it played out in such a straightforward manner that I'd figured out everything I needed to get the best ending in my initial playthrough of the game. And no, I don't mean this in a, I obsessively took notes for my next run. I mean, I did take notes, but it was sort of moot, since out of all of the permutations of the ending I could have gotten, I managed the best one. In a single shot. No fuss, no muss. Not that I stopped there. I'll admit I was morbidly curious to find out more and just how bad I could screw the pooch, which is how I found out that Simulacra 3 didn't just cut back on narrative complexity, it also trimmed a few quality of life features compared to its predecessors. Specifically, it's reverted back to the single save system of Simulacra 1 as opposed to the multiple checkpoints of 2, and it doesn't just stop there since it also lacks the fast forward mode typically awarded to you at the end of the other games, which is a bit of a baffling choice given how clustered the major narrative choices are to the climax, reducing the journey there to a bit of busy work which is only somewhat alleviated by small deviations in the dialogue along the way. Still, despite my use of the term busy work, I really can't fault my initial playthrough because Simulacra 3 does make a compelling puzzle game. If you're new to the franchise, the best way I can describe the experience is a narrative-laden puzzle box. Yes, it's a bit more streamlined to the point that your overall dialogue choices along the way feel less relevant to the ultimate outcome, beyond a few specific instances. That said, there's some solid puzzles along the way that see you scouring social media for the answer to riddles or discerning almost hidden elements in the UI to proceed further. It's honestly pretty fun stuff, and whilst I did find myself occasionally stumped, I ultimately found myself feeling satisfied whenever the answer finally dawned on me, which makes me twice as mad that one of my cats mauled my notebook while I was away doing this game. My precious clues. Thankfully, my findings weren't simply set down to paper, as Simulacra 3 lifts a simplified version of Simulacra 2's Warden system, which mostly means you're occasionally given the option to snapshot an image or clue that's relevant to your investigation, an image which can then be used to further dialogue or as a key of source to certain puzzles. It's not bad, but if you played the prior title, you'll definitely notice that creeping sense of linearity insofar as the solutions beyond a single instance. Still, I do have to give Simulacra 3 credit for one segment, as there is a section of the game that almost feels like an homage to the FMV title Night Trap. Whilst it's a bit lengthy and ultimately hard to fail, it does provide a different experience compared to anything else in the game. It also does a decent job of showcasing the overall creepier aesthetic elements in this title, because though there is a notable reduction in scope to the game complexity, the overall presentation definitely feels like it's continued to improve, which is nice for when it decides to inject some creepiness into an FMV segment or during your normal phone-based perusal. It was actually to the point that I found myself clicking on some of the videos and photos to simply scroll around and look for the small details that are squirreled away. Also, I really have to give Simulacra a bit of credit here. Its opening does a great job of introducing the shift in tone, with a cinematic intro that would feel right at home in a pulpy mystery movie on late-at-night TV. Speaking of which, you can expect the same quality insofar as the sound design. Whilst this does extend to the music when it occurs, what I primarily mean by is the subtle sound effects which will have you looking over your shoulder when they happen, and the effort put into the voice work. It's legitimately good stuff. But was it good enough? And ultimately that's a bit hazier. As much as Simulacra 3 comes in as a pleasing package and provides a more tonally consistent experience, it does feel notably reduced. When paired against the mechanical and narrative complexity and the sheer choice you have available to you in its predecessor, this iteration feels a bit flat insofar as its execution and ultimately its culmination. That's not to say there aren't some interesting and enjoyable conundrums to unfurl. I really did enjoy those segments, but this one seems to lack the additional layers, the tantalizing riddles that saw you scratching beneath the surface in future replays, helping to change up a journey which already had permutations that could potentially see things falling apart in a fairly drastic manner. What's more, while I did enjoy the story elements introduced here, if you're looking for deeper overarching lore between the games, you might find yourself coming up short, as this one feels a bit more self-contained. Yes, it references some elements from the earlier games, like the social apps Jabber and Chimera. There are some small winks and nods beside that, but if you're hoping for more hints at the larger scale story, at the source of the problem and the weird little conspiracy rabbit hole, you might have to hold your breath. That's not to say I didn't like Simulacra 3. I did enjoy it from my initial run through, and I think it's a decent narrative puzzler. That said, I think it definitely stumbles insofar as making your narrative choices feel meaningful in tandem with, well, the rest. Which is why at the end of the day, this one is more of a fumble in my books. Essentially, if you're a big fan of the Simulacra series or really want a curious puzzle game, I do think you can get some enjoyment out of this one, a decent bit of mileage, but you might want to curb your expectations going in. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or have something to say to me, an argument, or just a game you want me to check out, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy seeing new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. That said, if you want to find my Twitch or my Discord community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description for them links, and to my Patreon, just so you can support me and my editor Hop. That said, I'll catch y'all in the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.